When a group of 5 Finnish divers were exploring the deepest and darkest cave system in all of Northern Europe, they experienced the true terrors of the underwater environment. You see, this environment is not so friendly to us humans, and oftentimes can be terrifying. As for these 5 friends, everything quickly went downhill in a matter of minutes, all because of a few simple actions, which later turned into fatal mistakes. This is the tragic story of the Plura Cave disaster. It was about 10 in the morning on February 5th of 2014 when Patrik, Jari H, Jari U and Vesa got in a van with a trailer full of underwater diving equipment. They began their drive to Norway all the way from Finland. This was basically the start of it all. Their destination was none other than the beautiful Plura Cave. It is formed by a 35-meter wide river that rises abruptly out of the ground at the end of the Plura Valley, located in Nordland County, Norway. The 5 divers were good friends who had met each other during an exploration in the Ojamo mine located in west of Helsinki, Finland. They were all experienced, technical and certified CCR full cave divers. But as there weren't many places in Finland for cave diving, Ojamo mine was quite a famous location for divers to meet up and go on expeditions. However, unlike that dive, all 5 men knew that this one is going to be unfathomably dangerous. In fact, it is so hazardous that only about 12 divers had ever dared to even try it before. But that is what these guys wanted, a journey more challenging. Normally, the expeditions in Plura Cave take 30 minutes to an hour at a depth of 30 meters or so. But what these guys had in mind was to plunge much deeper and visit a particular destination called Steinoglet Cave. It is a dry cave about 100 meters below the surface. As you can see, their planned route, also known as the Traverse, begins at the Plura Cave entrance. So, if these guys dive into Plura, which is basically a pond, and swim underground for a long and exhausting distance of over 1600 feet or half a kilometer, they will end up emerging into a beautiful and colorful cave that is almost 1 kilometer long. This part of the cave is half dry and half filled with water. There you can enjoy and admire the grotto. Normally at this point, any other diver would have turned and swum back through the same route to Plura entrance as they should, and that would be the end of the exploration. However, not this group of friends. They did not want to stop just there. They decided instead of going back the same route and get to the surface through Plura entrance, they are going to continue on a course that quickly plunges even deeper, making their way petrifyingly more narrow and difficult through bone-chilling and pitch-black water. This new course would basically take them 130 meters below the surface. However, the second they descend to that depth, they also had to do a direct and long ascent in order to get to Steinoglet Cave. Now, if they want to get to surface, they cannot stop just yet. From there onwards, they have to again ascend another 90 meters to ultimately reach the Plura exit. The full distance between the entrance and the exit is 6,700 feet or 2,000 meters. For this whole expedition, it would take them approximately 5 hours. Now there's a huge difference. The standard 30-minute dive becomes a 5-hour-long journey into the unknown, dark and cold section of the cave. However, Patrik and Kai were the most experienced out of the 5 and even knew all the dangers of this journey, as they, along with another friend, Sammy, actually had done the traverse successfully back in 2013. In fact, they were the ones to discover the connection between the now known 2 entrances of the Plura Cave. Only difference was that time they had done the traverse from the exit to the entrance, basically the opposite direction of the traverse this time. It was a Friday when the 5 men arrived at Plura Cave past midnight, about 1 am to be specific. It was a 15-hour-long drive through Finland, Sweden and Norway. Everything was going perfect. They had brought all the diving equipment they needed, such as underwater scooters, a snowmobile, a few dozen large diving cylinders and other smaller equipment like rebreathers. On their drive to this location, they did plan everything in more detail. In a nutshell, here's what's gonna happen. They set off at the entrance, finish the dive successfully, clamber out of the cave, get in their van and drive to a local rented farm. There everyone would rest and spend the night. Then after a good night's sleep and rest, the next day they return to dive back again. So with this plan in mind, they all had some beers except one guy and then went to sleep. They decided not to wake up until 8 am the next morning. They needed to get as much sleep as possible as it is essential before a long dive. Thus the next morning came rather fast. They woke up to cold weather, 27 degrees Fahrenheit or -3 degrees Celsius. The sun didn't come up properly until like 9 am. They knew with this weather the sun wouldn't stay up any more than 7 hours. But during the day it was going to be pretty bright enough. So Jari U and Kai went to leave a change of clothes and equipment needed at the finish point. That way, after the dive, everyone can put on some dry clothes before returning back to the lodging. Meanwhile, Patrik and Jari H went to cut a triangular hole in the ice with the use of a chainsaw. There was a thick layer of ice covering the entrance. Likely it was almost a foot thick, and the chainsaw was barely long enough to penetrate it. But with some trying, eventually the job was done, and it revealed a breathtaking sight of the rocky bottom of the pond. The water was crystal clear. With this nice view, they got prepared carefully, making sure that everything will go smoothly. The 5 men split up into 2 teams and decided to dive one after another. Patrik and Jari H teamed into one, making Jari U, Vesa and Kai the second team. Then Patrik and Jari H said, "You know what, we'll set off first and you guys can join sometime after." Jari U, Vesa and Kai agreed and planned to slip into the pond in about 2 hours when the sediment in the water raised by Patrik and Jari H is settled. So the duo, in full preparedness, put on their waterproof dry suits and other diving gear. Jari H first dived under the ice as Patrik was standing by the hole holding his camcorder. Then he himself also dived under the ice. Then both began to move towards the entrance of the cave with the use of an underwater scooter. With it they can move faster and conserve energy. Meanwhile, the trio on the surface were watching their 2 buddies disappear in the water. So, the nightmare begins. Now it's been about an hour since Patrik and Jari H had set off. By this time, the 2 divers had dived through the dark and deep section of the cave and reached a depth of 110 meters. Once the 100 depth is passed, the cave remains for 400 meters overall, which means it's still pretty big. During this whole time, Patrik made sure to keep an eye on his friend. You see, although all 5 friends were experienced technical divers, Jari H was not the most experienced, especially in a cave system like Plura. So he was following behind Patrik, who is the most experienced as a rescue diver. As the duo reached the deepest section of the cave, which is 130 meters underwater, they turned off their scooters and properly admired the beauty of the cave. It looked out of this world. Its beauty and colorfulness were not like anything you see on the surface. Later, Patrik showed Jari H the deepest point of the whole cave system, and there appeared to be a sign, a round plate and 2 arrows attached to the guideline, pointing in the opposite direction, basically telling whoever is brave and crazy enough to dive this deep must turn back and swim to the surface, as it is absolutely not safe. Ironically, Patrik was the one who actually attached them with Kai and Sam last fall. At this depth, there was nothing but darkness, and it would have been so easy to get lost or swim the wrong direction and meet a dead end. By now, the two friends had advanced over 1 kilometer or 3,000 feet from the Plura entrance. They are getting closer and closer to the finish line. However, this was the point where the passage begins to ascend. Remember I said once they are at the deepest point, they have a direct ascent to Steinuglet Cave? This is it. It was a 90-degree turn, and the second they make it, they have to start the ascent. Here the cave becomes horrifyingly narrow. Not the narrowest on the route, but was enough to make someone anxious and nervous. Patrik went first. He squeezed himself through the narrow opening and succeeded, but quickly realized that Jari's light was nowhere to be seen behind him. As I said, Patrik was checking on Jari kind of routinely, but this time he was not there. Now anybody would have panicked to this news, but Patrik reacted rationally and kept his cool. However, not too long went by, he saw Jari's light moving up and down. Divers normally wave their lights up and down to distress signal. Patrik immediately turned back and swam towards it. As he was getting closer to Jari H, he could hear him yelling and calling out for help. Patrik then had shouted back and said, "Calm down, do not panic." You see, talking underwater is a real struggle because your lips cannot move around the mouthpiece, so their words weren't that clear or understandable to each other. Soon Patrik got to Jari H. The two are now positioned face to face in that narrow passage. Either way, it was clear to Patrik that Jari H has gotten himself entangled so well that he could not even move. It seemed this section was too small for someone to squeeze through with a lot of diving equipment. Jari H asked Patrik to detach one of his large bailout cylinders, since they looked to be why he got stuck in the first place. But Patrik quickly realized that it was too difficult to detach. Now it is crucial to know that they can barely move with the space they have in this passage. It was that small. But one way or another, Patrik managed to move the scooter a bit out of the way. But still, Jari H could not move. Patrik tried yanking but realized it could only lead to more distress, so that didn't work either. But it didn't take him any longer to notice that Jari H's scooter was actually the problem. It was stuck under a big rock. Patrik shouted and told Jari, "Hey, your scooter is stuck," and it actually explained why he couldn't move either. Then Jari himself said, "Let me try to yank it free." Thus he tried wrenching it with sheer force and the scooter came off eventually, although it did make him more agitated. Nonetheless, all this only led Jari H to breathe faster. One thing you should never do underwater is panicking, because there's a phenomenon called carbon dioxide poisoning, where higher amounts of carbon dioxide are absorbed into a diver's bloodstream at a high speed. This usually happens due to the extreme depth. So, when someone has an excessive amount of carbon dioxide in their body, oxygen levels reduces rapidly, making it hard for them to breathe. If this deadly condition did not lead to dizziness, chest pain or even death, it will lead to hypercapnia. It is just as worse. It will cause paranoia, confusion, and disorientation in a person. It is basically like being intoxicated. Now imagine being drunk or high underwater. That is the last thing you should be in such an environment. You would forget all the safety precautions trying to swim peculiarly. In fact, you might even throw out your mouthpiece or detach other diving gear. So, to avoid this hazard, divers use equipment called rebreathers. They artificially absorb the same carbon dioxide amount a diver exhales and prevent any more from being absorbed into bloodstream from outside. In other words, it basically recycles the gas a diver inhales and exhales. However, if a diver breathes too fast, the rebreather cannot keep up and likely fails to function, which is why panicking or swimming fast is something divers never do. Sounds familiar? Yeah, that is exactly what's happening with Jari H here. Once he got stuck and twisted, he forgot all the safety precautions and did what anybody would have done. He gave into his instincts and started breathing faster as an overload of terrors was filling his brain. Patrik saw this coming as he knew Jari had no experience in being in such a dreadful situation. So when he realized that and saw his friend actually appears to lose his senses, he immediately gave Jari a cylinder of his gas to reduce the excessive amounts of carbon dioxide in his system. And all while Patrik kept switching the mouthpieces because he himself also needed to stay calm and keep the carbon dioxide levels at bay. But none of that was helpful. Jari H kept on getting worse. He was getting weaker and more disoriented by the second. He simply forgot to even keep his mouth closed and started helplessly swallowing mouthfuls of water. This went on for 15 to 20 minutes. It was all over by then. Right before Patrik's eyes, Jari passed away, not even knowing what's happening to him. It was Patrik's worst nightmare. As a rescue diver and a firefighter, Patrik had seen many dead bodies, but none of them were his friends like Jari H. Patrik immensely got shaken by this. Even he began breathing faster. He wanted to free Jari H's body as he was still stuck, but it felt almost impossible. On top of that, he knew the second team, Kai, Jari U and Vesa, are probably getting ready to dive in by now. This made Patrik even more distressed, because if they were to see their friend's corpse blocking the way, God knows how they would react. Most likely they will freak out and it will become an even bigger disaster. As Patrik clung to a rock on the wall, he realized all that, and also how the same fate is awaiting him if he did not pull himself together and stop wasting too much of his energy and oxygen. So he forced himself to calm down. Only once that was done, he came to the consensus that there's literally nothing he can do anymore but to continue towards Plura Cave, as he is already much closer to it. But that is easier said than done. His next big problem was that he spent too long trying to help Jari H. It has put him at a risk of running out of oxygen, decompression sickness and nitrogen narcosis. These conditions occur due to a couple reasons. 1. Spending too long at an extreme depth where the pressure in the water is rapidly decreasing. 2. Breathing highly compressed air from air cylinders as they contain more dense oxygen, helium and nitrogen than what we have on the surface. So when Patrik is breathing, these gases get dissolved in his system, causing a number of changes to his health state. But nitrogen specifically can do more harm by forming bubbles in blood and tissues. This is known as decompression sickness. It will cause pain in muscles and joints. In severe cases, it would lead to even strokes and organ failure. On the other hand, nitrogen narcosis will have an effect on Patrik's consciousness. He will get a rapid rush of euphoria for a short while. This is similar to being intoxicated with carbon dioxide poisoning or hypercapnia. So, as you can imagine, all these are fatal hazards. Patrik then checked his dive computer that measures the depth and time of the dive. He learned exactly how fast he is running out of time. In order to avoid decompression sickness, from now on he has to swim at an extremely slow pace and stop multiple times along the way, spending 400 minutes additionally in the water. This is also known as decompression stops. With these pauses, Patrik's body has extra time to release dissolved gases, primarily nitrogen, in his blood, while also adjusting to the changing pressure in the water as the surface is getting closer. This is the only way for a safe ascent to the surface. He knew if he ever rushed and swam too fast, he could end up not returning to the surface at all. So, 120 minutes of decompression time, once shown on his dive computer, has now increased to 7 hours. Hell, the whole expedition was only supposed to be 5 hours long. This caught Patrik off guard. He wanted to swim back towards Plura entrance to warn the trio on the way, but that is impossible now, as he will have to swim even longer, making more decompression stops. Of course, he cannot do that. He does not have enough oxygen. He did have a bailout system though, which is basically an emergency supply of air to use in case the primary air tank was ever running out of oxygen. But that cylinder stuck with Jari H, and even if Patrik freed it, most of the bailout gas in it was spent when he gave it to Jari. So, no point. All these factors only led this situation to get more life-threatening. With this dawning realization, Patrik knew he had to make the hard decision and leave his friend's dead body while also having no clue of what would happen to Kai, Jari U and Vesa. So eventually, he did make that decision and continued on his course towards Plura Cave. But on the way, he couldn't control his emotions. He was crushed with guilt, fear and suspense. Of course, he made the most suitable and righteous decision considering all the factors, but still, he couldn't help but feel like he is leaving his friends behind to die. As these horrible thoughts were occurring in Patrik's mind, Kai, Vesa and Jari U were finished preparing and have begun their dive. Of course, they don't know what they are swimming into, at least not yet. As planned, the 2 hours went by and the trio lowered themselves under the ice one by one and started moving towards the entrance. Just like the first team, they entered the cave. Vesa, being the first diver of the team, were followed by Jari U and Kai in the rear. As expected, the sediment stirred up by Patrik and Jari H has well settled by now. Vesa wanted to be more careful and insisted on bringing 5 additional large cylinders to use at different depths. Kai and Jari U were hesitant at first because it was obvious that the narrow passages would not allow a diver to bring so many equipment. But despite that, the two friends eventually agreed and said, okay, since you insist so much, we could give it a try. Kai agreed to carry 1 additional cylinder so that Vesa could move more freely and will be less likely to get stuck in any passages. They gradually swam and reached a depth of 110 meters. That is the narrow and scary part of the cave. And just as they predicted, Vesa got stuck at the 125 depth. He tried to slide through an opening that was too small for him and all of his equipment. It was actually one of his fins that had entangled in the guidelines. Though it would not have happened if he had dove through in the right position. So the trio hasn't even reached Jari H's dead body yet, and they are facing some troubles of their own. Vesa yelled, "Take off my fin," to Jari U and Kai in the rear. His voice sounds much higher due to the helium inhaled from the tank. Jari U tried and managed to disentangle the stuck fin, but this whole ordeal made Vesa a bit agitated. They spent about 5 minutes trying to free the fin. It added an extra hour to their decompression time. Vesa always hated having to stop for too long in cold water. Even so, they continued their dive and descended down to the deepest section of the cave. Just like Patrik and Jari H did, the trio also saw and passed the round plastic plate with the warning. Not long after that, Vesa heard a familiar sound, a beep. He immediately recognized it was the distress signal of a diver, and something must be wrong. There, he sees something, or rather someone, stuck ahead in the small passage. At first, he could not make out of who that is, but the second he was close enough, he saw it was Jari H. It shook him to his very core. He would have never expected to see such a horrifying sight. Somehow, he did not panic. He was trained and experienced enough to do so. He calmly grasped and tried to find a way around the body. However, he doesn't know whether the two behind him also saw the site of the accident. Yet, he quickly took off some of his gear to fit through the narrow passage. But he also tried to warn Jari U and Kai. So, he shouted through his mask and said, "There's a big problem here. It's Jari H. He's dead, and they all should not panic right now and find a way around the body." Then he saw a light appear behind him and realized it does not look so good. Jari U and Kai appeared to not handle the situation so well. Now, the events next are not the clearest. Well, Vesa was not able to see much of anything behind him anyway. And as for Kai, he simply had no proper recollection of his surroundings due to nitrogen narcosis. Somewhere along the way, he had developed it. But regardless that, he somehow managed to catch up with Jari U, who was a few feet ahead. But something appeared to be wrong with him. Kai tried catching his attention by pointing the light at the guideline. Then he asked what was wrong, but what Jari U yelled back was not loud or clear enough, so Kai couldn't make anything out of it. Not only that, he hadn't even learned about the gruesome fate of Jari H yet. Jari U, on the other hand, had seen the full side of Jari H's accident and his dead body. By then, it has clearly impacted him. He was swimming with such weird movements and even switched from his primary air supply system to the bailout system. Kai was unsure whether Jari U was trapped, but he made sure that he wasn't and that the bailout gas was on. As time went on, when Kai desperately tried to help his friend, he noticed no sign of equipment failure or anything of that sort. Everything looked and seemed fine. But moments later, Jari U was dead. There was literally nothing Kai could have done but now to process the death of his friend. Anyhow, shortly thereafter, he saw another body. It was none other than Jari H next to the fins of Vesa, who is desperately and fiercely kicking to get around the body. Can you imagine witnessing the death of your friend right in front of you and then seeing another friend with the same fate just seconds after? That must be petrifying. It doesn't help when all that happens underwater. But what's even worse is that Kai and Vesa had to stay calm the whole time. No matter what happens, they must not panic. Later, Kai shouted to Vesa and gave the news of Jari U's death. "Let's turn back," Kai yelled to Vesa again. But Vesa couldn't imagine swimming back towards the entrance. It was too risky and would take much longer, not to mention the extra decompressing time. This train of thought only made him breathe faster, but he was adept enough to quickly bring his elevated heart rate down. But his decision to not turn back remained the same. Kai, on the other hand, thought Vesa isn't thinking clearly and soon will panic and exhaust himself if they did not stop shouting as to what they should do next. Kai was more experienced as this was his second time diving through the cave, so he became more logical about the situation and made up his mind to not go with Vesa, who was hell-bent on continuing to Steinuglet Cave. Absolutely crushed with the thought of having to turn back, not even knowing what Vesa is going to do, Kai presumed Patrik may also be dead, especially considering the current circumstances. But regardless all these emotions, Patrik kept himself calm and began his journey back towards the entrance alone. Back on the other side of the cave, Patrik was struggling. He could not make the ascent to the surface for hours, almost like he was stuck, not physically but mentally. His friend's death has hit him hard. Think about it. He just lost one of his friends and there's a good chance that his other friends will also not make it. He had almost given up and was only thinking about his family and drinking sprees with his buddies. He was getting weaker due to the freezing cold water, so he held himself against the rocks on the wall. It was getting scarily dark. On top of these harsh conditions, Patrik had two choices with his gear. He could either use his light to see in the dark or the thermal vest to stay warm, but not both at the same time. The remaining battery power of his underwater scooter was not enough for both. In previous dives, Patrik had spent too long for decompressing, but never in water this cold. At a certain point, he even swam around in circles to keep himself warm. However, what Patrik didn't know was that Vesa was not far behind him, so in the end, Patrik might not be the only survivor. Vesa had his own troubles. He was exhausted so much that he was basically lying down on the floor of the passages. That is how he spent his additional hours for decompression. And to keep warm, he placed his back against the wall and kicked as fast as one is able to in the water. This is the longest Vesa has ever been in water. It's been over 6 hours by this time. Like Kai and Patrik, he also endured the feeling of guilt for not being able to help Jari U back in that passage. Hours passed. He switched to his last oxygen cylinder, but wasn't sure how long he will be able to last with it. Even so, his mind was too busy thinking about his wife and 3 children, waiting for him back at home. It was quite clear at this point, the only thing that's keeping these divers from not giving up is their families and friends. As Kai was swimming, he began to feel that the chances of him surviving was also very thin. He did have 2 rebreathers though, but still, too many odds were against his survival. His dive computer indicated that he has to spend an additional hour in the water for decompressing. But Kai took his chances and continues his ascent steadily without spending any extra time on decompressing. He did a quick evaluation of his likelihood of survival and determined that he was more likely to run out of oxygen than to suffer from decompression sickness. He has skipped a few decompression stops in his previous expeditions, but surely never as many as he is about to now. Luckily, he came across an air chamber on the way. It probably would have felt like a miracle to him. The second he spotted it, he got to it as fast as he could and breathed the trapped air inside it. That way, he could conserve at least a little bit of his air in the tank. This was a decently big air chamber with an unlimited supply of oxygen. Thus, it kinda made him a little tempted to stay instead of dying trying to ascend to the surface. But how long could he last in it? What if they never checked and saw him here? Plus, if everyone else was dead, there would be no one back on the surface to alert the authorities and rescue divers. So no one would even know he was alive. Although the air chamber was relatively close to the entrance, from a rescue team's perspective, it is still at a pretty insane depth of over 100 meters. So even if they came to rescue him, it will take quite a while for them to get to him. When these thoughts were crossing Kai's mind, he felt absolutely hopeless. Some time passed and something just triggered in him. He wanted to survive no matter what. So he inhaled a lot of oxygen one last time and continued on his course. Shortly thereafter, something else unexpected happened. His underwater scooter stopped working. This added an extra 30 minutes to the ascent. He simply did not have enough oxygen. There was no way he could make it now. He feared for his life. He knew soon there will be no more oxygen for him to breathe, and that the low oxygen levels in his blood and tissues will prevent his limbs from moving, making him unable to swim any further. Ultimately, he will lose consciousness and drown. All these terrors he was feeling were only making the situation more fatal, but miraculously, they also put him on a full survival mode. He was done questioning his luck surviving and started swimming as fast as he could. Even so, he still made a few stops to decompress. During these pauses, he had to swim around a bit in order to keep himself warm as the water was getting colder by the minute. Nonetheless, he continued this momentum until the end. All 3 surviving divers, namely Patrik, Vesa and Kai, were getting closer to the surface. But they were still not in the clear, as their air could run out any second. On the way, Patrik almost gave up, but at one point he thought he saw a light behind him. He wasn't sure at first, but then he realized it was from one of his friends. So he turned and dove back down. To Patrik's surprise, it was Vesa. He couldn't believe it. This was the best thing to happen to Patrik in this situation. Seeing Vesa along with the idea that others might also make it out from the other side of the cave gave him strength to finish the rest of the ascent. So both Patrik and Vesa continued their dive again. Patrik made a few more decompression stops and eventually climbed out of the cave successfully. Vesa followed behind Patrik but had to spend a bit longer in the water than Patrik to decompress. By the time Patrik was on the surface, it was a few minutes past 9 p.m, half an hour too early compared to the time on the dive computer. The planned 5-hour expedition lasted 8.5 hours. Patrik was absolutely worn out. He sat down and waited for Vesa. Vesa was about 6 meters below the surface. At a depth of around 3 meters, he felt an intense pain in his arms. Vesa began to suffer from decompression sickness. Even spending an hour longer in the water than Patrik, he was still about 90 meters too early compared to the time on the dive computer. Once he stepped on the surface, his right knee also began aching. Another sign his condition is not getting any better. Nonetheless, he is on the surface now, which is good news. But what about Kai? Well, he took the longer route, and despite the drawbacks on the way, he eventually reached the Plura entrance 3 hours after Patrik and Kai did from the other side. When he emerged from the Plura entrance to the pond, there was a layer of ice covering the entire pond. He looked for the triangular hole they cut through the ice in the morning. He knew where it should be, but it also seemed to be covered with ice. It had been frozen shut. Nevertheless, he finally found the hole, which luckily was only covered with relatively a thin layer of ice. He was able to break it and pushed all his gear onto the icy surface. When he clambered out of the freezing water, there was nobody else around on the surface. It was about 1:30 in the morning and pitch black dark. He has spent 11.5 hours in the water. It is really a miracle he survived in such cold water for so damn long. Kai quickly walked up to the vehicle. He got in it along with some of his diving gear. He cranked, started the engine and turned the lights on. Meanwhile, Patrik and Vesa were at the farm waiting. They changed into dry clothes and without taking any rest, they decided to return to the pond and alerted the Norwegian authorities. Now it is about 2 in the morning. Patrik and Vesa noticed something. It was their van. It has its lights on. Right away, they ran into it in the snow and found Kai inside it on the floor. Kai, seeing no one outside the cave, had thought only he had survived. At first, when he saw Patrik and Kai outside the car, he had assumed that they were town residents. Of course, it didn't take him too long to realize. So, the 3 that survived were finally met. Kai said never again would he put his head underwater. Although they were happy to see each other, they were still shocked and even more devastated by the fates of their 2 friends, Jari H and Jari U. Police carried out an investigation into the accident and all the events leading up to it. Patrik, Kai and Vesa were interrogated. The bodies of Jari H and Jari U were at such a dangerous depth, the authorities had to launch a full-scale recovery operation. So, the rescue team descended down into the cave and found the spot of the accident, but unfortunately, they were unable to free the bodies. Eventually, the authorities had to call the mission off and considered it was too risky. Thus, they decided to leave the corpses of the 2 victims in the cave. Later, they closed down the cave and the area around it as well. A diving ban was imposed. However, Patrik, Vesa and Kai were not having this. They could not just move on with their lives. Patrik had already made up his mind. He made a promise to Jari H's wife and others. He said he and his friends will dive again and retrieve the corpses. Patrik thought having the bodies would at least help the families grieve. Later, Patrik asked all his friends whether they are up for an illegal retrieval. Well, he received good news. It seemed that everybody else also had the same idea and was only waiting for the word. So, everybody was willing to partake. The group had planned the operation in secret because if they were to ever ask Norwegian police for permission, it was certain they would refuse. But Patrik and others were confident about the plan as they knew this cave system more than anybody else as the first original explorers of it. This operation was titled Diving into the Unknown and became a popular story around the world. On 22nd of March 2014, a team of 27 friends dived into Plura. Two smaller teams worked at shallower levels at two ends of the traverse while Patrik, Sam and Kai descended once again to the deepest point of the cave to recover the bodies. Vesa was the surface manager as he was still recovering from the decompression sickness and the spinal injury caused by it. The time allocated to the whole operation was 5 days. However, the whole operation only lasted for 3 to 4 days with 101 hours of diving time. Yeah, that means they succeeded in recovering the corpses. When Patrik finally ascended to the surface with the corpses, he said, "I've been thinking about this every single night since I walked out of here. Last time I didn't know whether to come back up or stay down there," he added, implying the deaths of his friends had affected him deeply. If we had done a practice run then, things would have been different. It was totally our fault. So eventually the bodies were recovered and Patrik kept his promise to Jari H's wife and others. The families and friends of both victims were finally able to grieve and say a final goodbye to their loved one. Alright then, we have got to the end of the story. I hope you guys enjoyed it or even learned something new. I'll see you in my next video of Night Dangers. And until then, stay safe out there and goodbye.